from the start there was sort of chaos about the sort of landing, who was getting into which landing craft, which order they were going in it, and so on. And that was perhaps to be the hallmark of the operation right from start to finish. So I suppose those initial impressions really were, this is an unfriendly environment, and the other thing is very much that we were going to be beset with chaos, and the secret of coping here was just accept that and work through it. I think it's probably the most dominant thing that went through my mind. I suppose, having mentioned the going, it's probably worth mentioning too that within a day or two, we found that the boots we'd been equipped with were utterly hopeless. The DMS boot, sort of compressed, reconstituted compressed leather, sort of became like blotting paper. And so by the end of the second day on Sussex Mountain, and I think we've got a slide somewhere, slide 3 might be worth putting up, but yes, that was the sort of ground that became our home for the first week or so, and digging down was impractical because within sort of 3 or 4 inches you hit the water level, so you had to build up these peat igloos, and so by the end of day 2, people were already beginning to suffer with bad feet and so on, and inevitably it was going to lead to trench foot if we weren't careful, and that's totally incapacitating. So I think the second day I said, right, when you're not actually on stag, to my company, I said, you take your boots off and look after your feet, rather against the sort of normal SOPs. If there's any risk of contact, you normally sleep with the boots on and everything else. And I could see that this was not the place to slavishly follow SOPs, so that's what we did.
And I mean, obviously, because you talk a lot about the hostile environment within that, and now throughout that sort of initial series, there's very little sort of Argentine land activity, isn't it? I mean, there've been the units on Fannin Head during the actual landings proper and the morning before, but obviously the Argentine air activity is building up. And I mean, from Sussex Mountain, obviously you're looking down into San Carlos water and you're seeing what's going on, but are you also building up a picture at this stage about the Argentine land capabilities as well? Are there active patrols going out trying to identify where they might be? Sort of, how are you sort of factoring that in as well as battling the environment itself?
Yeah, well, it certainly the Argentinian Air Force really got into the game. I mean, as soon as daybreak came up on the 21st, they were into the game, and sort of overflying us. But I mean, frankly, they weren't interested in a battalion spread out, over sort of 5 acres or so. Their targets were clearly the beachhead for the Bukhara, and for the fast jets coming in, it was the shipping. So yeah, we were untroubled. There were a few vain attempts by us to try and engage those aircraft on the plod up to Sussex Mountain, but pretty forlorn, frankly. And then, I mean, we went reverse slope on Sussex Mountain, which is a pretty standard procedure. But we had our own patrols and OPs forward of the crest of the mountain. So again, trying to at least dominate the ground immediately beyond us in that way. And I suppose we'd have probably done so even more aggressively than we did, but there were some rumours of SAS patrols out around Goose Green and so on. So, we had fairly sort of close limits of exploitation. But yeah, I mean, very much sort of standard drill, trying to just dominate the ground. But I mean, frankly, I think in that first week, we got one report from one of our OPs of enemy in Cantera House, which is about sort of 10 miles south on the coast. And H got me to send a platoon down there by helicopter to see what was going on. They got down there, and clearly there had been enemy there, but they'd gone. So it was, I think, fairly obvious that we weren't under immediate any immediate threat from ground forces.
And I mean, so at which stage? I mean, because obviously there's from the histories that have been written about it have made much of sort of this build-up and this conflict between a build-up of resources and then an offensive action. And the map we showed at the beginning shows you that it doesn't look particularly far on a map how far San Carlos is to Stanley.
Yeah.
But given the terrain we talked about, let alone what happens on the 25th of May, with the loss of the helicopters, that starts to become a bit of a challenge. So, I mean, at which stage did you begin to get a sense that there was a bigger drive towards actually offensive actions, manoeuvre, something more than what was just sort of the build-up?
I suppose it was, I think around the 24th, 25th of May that we were warned off for a raid on Goose Green. And I think it was on the 24th, maybe 25th, I'm trying to remember now. D Company, my company, was deployed to Camilla Creek House, about 8 miles north of Darwin and Goose Green, to basically secure an assembly area for a sort of battalion level raid. It was battalion minus, we were not going to take our mortars. We were going to have half a battery of guns move forward in support and so on. And interesting how this developed, because I mean, I think it was very much H. Jones, our CO, who was just, I think we were all getting a bit dispirited about sitting on, above Bomb Alley, San Carlos Water, and watching, you know, kind of a ship a day being sunk by the Argentine Air Force while we were sitting in these rather grim conditions on the hilltop, twiddling our thumbs. And I mean, frankly, you know, there was the odd muttering of it's going to be another Gallipoli if we don't get a move on. And I think H felt this very acutely and was clearly pushing brigade to for a chance for the battalion to get stuck in at Goose Green. It was the nearest obvious target to the beachhead. I think the other factor in H's thinking perhaps was that where we were on the beachhead, we were further than any other unit from Stanley, and therefore we might be left to secure the beachhead rather than getting stuck into the serious stuff that was to follow. So he was desperate to get stuck in, and I have to say, I think so with the rest of us. We were just, it was pretty dispiriting, just sitting there twiddling our thumbs. Now that raid, I mean, I got halfway to Camilla Creek that night, and the raid was then cancelled for lack of helicopter lift to lift the guns in, and that I think was tied up with another operation that was taking place to get the SAS onto Mount Kent. It was all a question of priorities, I guess. So having got halfway there, we then had to plod all the way back. Another little blow to morale, I guess. And certainly when I got back about, you know, it must have been early hours of the morning, you know, I was worried because I'd already mentioned the boots and the feet. And, you know, on the plod back, in my mind, I was sort of thinking, you know, we've only got so many feet, so many miles per foot before, you know, the boots and the feet inside them just give out. And certainly got back to Sussex Mountain and, you know, said as much to H that we just wasted so many miles of our feet. And I've got to say, I didn't get much sympathy. I think he probably thought that I was sort of blaming him or something, but I mean, really, it was out of his control. But and it was a point made in all seriousness. I mean, I think it was a factor that we really had to start considering. But as I say, H, I think he was so utterly pissed off at having his raid pulled that he really didn't want to listen to my views at that point. But it was an important point. And then following on from that, 2 days later, you know, he called me in again and said the raid's back on. Only this time we're all going, meaning that we're going to take some mortars. In the end, we didn't take them all. For another battalion size raid. So again, my job was to secure the assembly area for the raid at Camilla Creek, and the rest of the battalion would sort of get themselves organised in slightly slower time and follow me down there later in the night. So off we set. When we got to Camilla Creek, that wasn't without incident. The house itself was supposed to be adjusted by our guns. It was again a very dark night. The ground is amazingly featureless around there. And so I knew we were getting close to Camilla Creek, but I wasn't quite sure how far I had to go. I didn't want to go blundering in. There may have been enemy there. So I called a fire mission onto the house, thinking, right, I'll, not as well for two reasons. One, just to, put off any Argentinians who may have been there. But the more important reason really was to sort of say, right, there it is. There's Camilla Creek House, right where the rounds are landing. We got the fire mission in, and to our surprise, the rounds landed about 1,000 meters behind us. Not great news. I knew we hadn't overshot the track. It was the same track we were on, went right past the house. We couldn't have done that. Confidence in the gun started to evaporate a bit at that point. And in the end, we just carried on advancing to contact until we saw the outlines of the house. And then I got one platoon to clear through it. And we made ourselves at home. And it was first night in whatever it was, 7 nights that we managed to find some shelter. I would say we'd gone down there in light scales because we already made up our minds that trying to cover this sort of ground with fully laid bergens, 100 pounds plus, was just impractical. So it's light scales, no sleeping bags or anything like that. So getting inside the buildings was, I got to say, quite welcome. But 2 hours later, the rest of the battalion turn up, and they all want to find a little bit of roof space as well. So I think I ended up with one of my platoons sort of squeezing into the downstairs loo of the main farm building, and the lights went out the window. But there we are. Now, when H joined me there, the first thing I think he said to me virtually was, right, it's no longer a raid. We're going to attack the settlement. So somewhere in that sort of journey south, the mission had been elevated, if you like. And I mean, the reasons have never been quite clear as to quite what happened. But I mean, I think H was very clear that a hit and run raid made no sense to him. Kind of at what point do you start hitting, and when do you start running? For a start, is a pretty good question. I think the other reason that he was, totally against the raid is I think he understood that supposing we had just done a hit and run raid, there was no clear objective as to when we should stop and so on. I think it could have very easily been spun by the Argentinians as, first blood to Argentina, if you like, Parachute Battalion forced to withdraw. So he was desperate to get this mission elevated, if you like. But I think the other thing that was going on also was that Julian Thompson was by then under huge pressure from Whitehall to do something sort of noticeable, because the news was consistently bad until then, with the ship a day being sunk and so on. And I think the view in Whitehall was probably partly for reasons of public opinion that we had to have a success, and I think partly they were also still under pressure from the Americans to negotiate, and that clearly wasn't going to suit the government either. So I think they were desperate for an early victory, and that's really what led to that elevation. I think it's a combination of factors. The trouble is that we were set up really for a raid and not the much more significant challenge of capturing the settlements. So, for instance, only half a battery of guns, only one section of mortars. We could have taken CVRTs. We didn't have those, and they really probably would have made a hell of a difference later on. Well, it goes back to these old military lessons, doesn't it? That first identify and keep to the aim, and if you don't get that sorted, then what follows tends to be a bit of a mishmash. And so I think we were under-resourced, I think, by any sort of reckoning based on even the sort of fairly thin intelligence there was. I know that Julian Thompson sort of kind of beats himself up a bit and sort of said, I should have given you more resources, etc. But I mean, I think his hands were tied anyway. I mean, to him, Goose Green was a distraction. You know, the war was going to be settled around Stanley. He had very limited resources, especially logistics. You know, he couldn't afford to go and, you know, concentration of effort was in his mind. He couldn't afford to fritter them away on sideshows. So I think I have every sympathy with him sort of keeping us, if you like, short of resources. But I think the other thing is as well is, yes, he might have said, yeah, you can have a whole battery, but I don't think there was the helicopter lift at that time to keep a whole battery supplied with ammunition. So why go and risk 6 guns when you've only got enough ammunition for 3? All sorts of sort of factors in play at this point, which all kind of complicated the issue. And I think, you know, one of our company commanders, John Crossan, described it, you know, it ended up as a bit of a come as you are party. But I think that's what the Parachute Regiment's there for, you know, standing up to these sort of moments.
And I mean, and were there concerns about that during the O group when, you know, when this stuff is being, when the plan is being sketched out about, you know, the silent and noisy phases of the battle? Were these concerns there, or as you sort of just, as you say, you sort of reach that stage of come as you are and truce paratus, you're going to go on and do it?
Yeah. Well, I suppose really, yeah, we were just accepting things as they were. I mean, you know, it was the first time at this sort of level of operations that for virtually all of us. So, you know, kind of take it as it comes. And, you know, I would say we were certainly, I think, sort of up for anything, you know, whatever. But I mean, I do remember there was sort of kind of rumors floating around, you know, sort of gossip coming back from SAS patrols who come back through our lines on Sussex Mountain, you know, there's no will to fight, you know, knock them hard and, you know, they'll collapse. You know, yeah, there's not many of them down there and all that sort of thing. So no, it wasn't really until the O group that I think the penny dropped that this was going to be kind of fairly tough. I remember saying to my sergeant major just as I went off to the O group, you know, looking at the map, it's a narrow isthmus we were going to have to advance down, so limited scope for manoeuvre. I mean, I think we might have a map of that somewhere. Yeah, it was slide 5. But just saying to my sergeant major, you know, okay, this could be a pushover, but you know, there's every risk it's going to be, you know, actually quite a long, hard slog. Went to the O group, and this is actually, this map here is, you know, what I marked up at the start of the O group of enemy positions. And actually, yeah, it's one thing worth mentioning as well, of course, is that early that morning, just as the whole battalion had arrived at Camilla Creek, we started listening into the BBC World Service on our HF radios, and you know, was staggered when you know, the news came up and sort of said there's reported in Parliament today that there is now a parachute battalion within 7 miles of Goose Green. I mean, if that isn't giving the game away, I don't know what is. If we could listen in our HF radios, I'm sure as hell the Argentinians could as well. So there's all this sort of stuff going on, and the result was this was the map markings of the enemy positions, and you can see this, you know, sort of a good battalion between us and the settlements, and then more troops themselves in the settlement themselves, and so clearly. Our guess was 2 things. First of all, we first real glimpses to what the sort of strength of the target was, and it was going to be much more than just knock on the door and help ourselves to dinner. And the other thing I think that was pretty obvious was that you know, the Argentinians had deployed for an attack from the north, and you know, put two and two together from that BBC broadcast. So yeah, I think at the O Group, the penny dropped that this was going to be quite a tough call. And I think it's, you know, I often kind of try to put myself in H's shoes here. He must have been under acute pressure, I think. I mean, one is he pushed for this attack the settlements, as you know, he pushed for elevating mission without a great enthusiastic support of brigade. And then, you know, kind of eventually having had patrols out all day, putting together some picture of the enemy disposition and so on, seeing all this red on the map must have got him thinking, you know, am I doing the right thing here? I mean, you know, it was a pretty tall order if you look at that map, I think, for one battalion with fairly powerless fire support to take on. All I would say, though, I mean, you know, and actually, see, it's before you're in action that, you know, I often think that spirit is really tested. You know, once you're engaged, I found it the same with my climbing. You know, once you're on the route, you know, you're occupied with a problem in front of your nose, but it was beforehand that, you know, the sort of question marks are always sort of sneaking around in your mind. So I think he must have had a tough day. All I would say is when he gave his orders, there was not a hint of doubt at all. And I mean, I think he absolutely, well, he owned his spurs in my view. I mean, he left us in no doubt that we could do this, that we would do this. I mean, it went beyond just confidence. It was a complete sort of conviction that we were better than they were and that we would succeed. And I kind of think that sort of spirit in the battalion was we could have taken 50% casualties and we'd have still been pushing forward. It was that sort of degree of commitment, I think, that he managed to engender. Now, a lot of people since have sort of criticized his orders and the plan. I mean, it was, in retrospect, probably far too detailed and prescriptive, especially given all the sort of unknown factors still. But I was happy with that. I mean, 6 phases, very brief terms, 6 phases. The last phase, fighting through the settlements, would start at daylight the following day. Silent, then going noisy once we're in contact, and you know, say night attack really until that last phase. It probably was too detailed, too prescriptive, but for me, what it did was it painted a very clear picture of actually how we would get to the final objectives, the 2 settlements of Darwin and Goose Green, and it's. I put it in terms of visualization, you know, that sort of when you're training top athletes, you know, you get them to sort of visualize crossing the finishing line first. And it's sort of, I suppose it was something like that, you know, I looked at those orders and said, yeah, okay, I've got a sort of picture now from what we're going to do. I've got to say, when I went back to my company, by then it was dark. Trying to brief in great detail in the dark and so on was, you know, had its limitations. And I took them in detail up to sort of phase 3. And then I said, you know, frankly, after that, anything could happen. So, you know, kind of wait out. And I suspect, you know, the other company commanders probably took it much the same way. But yeah, I mean, overall, we got the orders. And you know, we were convinced that we would still deliver.
And so, I mean, and therefore talked about the plan. Can you talk me through how, you know, talk me through the action from your perspective as you saw it? And you know, I know you and I have been lucky enough. Well, I've been lucky enough to walk the ground with you, but I'm sure that our audience would love to hear just, you know, how you essentially progressed through and experienced the battle.
Okay. Well, first of all, I say that D Company started the battle in reserve, and this was no surprise on every exercise beforehand I'd ever done with 2 Para. D Company was always in reserve. I mean, I think it's sort of. I sometimes thought there could have been more imagination the way things were done. You know, it was always A, B reserve. You know, every exercise allocation of resources. You know, actually, this is quite an important point. A so and so, B so and so. Oh, D, yeah. In the case of FOOs, the establishment had just been reduced from forward observation officers for the artillery. The establishment had just been reduced from 3 to 2. Now, you know, a battery traditionally supports, you know, one battalion, and the battalion has 3 rifle companies. So, you know, hence the logic of normally, traditionally 3 FOOs. The logic of reducing it suddenly to 2 has always rather escaped me. But when it came to resources being allocated, you know, guess who didn't get a trained FOO? It's B Company, and that was to have some implications later on. So there we go, in reserve, and we were at the back of the battalion snake, the column going down from Camilla Creek to the start line, which is just at Camilla Creek Bridge, if you can see that on the map, or just south of Camilla Creek Bridge. It degenerated into chaos right from the start, really. I suppose not degenerate is too strong a word, but you know, as ever, nothing went quite right. I was behind in this battalion snake, behind battalion main headquarters, who'd been told to you know, set up on the bridge, and also at the bridge I was supposed to be met by patrol company's guides. Well, by the time I'd sort of muddled my way through this morass of people in battalion main headquarters, God knows what they were all doing, you know, I missed the guides. So we overshot the access track, which is where I was supposed to sort of follow and go firm. And we therefore got a bit lost on the way down. I got to be honest about that. You know, I blame the lead platoon commander. That's what they're there for, really. But anyway, I got to take my share of the responsibility. So I knew we'd gone wrong. We got back onto the access track, but unknowingly, I then got in front of H and his TAC headquarters. And first of all, A Company took on Burnside House on the sort of left, which you might see marked up on the map there. And then B Company took on the first enemy position marked on our right. So if you look at the map on your left, the west. And I was sort of sitting there on this access track waiting for the chance to you know, get busy myself, and H came stomping up behind me, appalled to find, you know, really pissed off to find that his reserve company was in front of his TAC headquarters, delivered me sort of ritual bollocking. But then interestingly said, look, I'm thinking, you know, people sort of say, oh, it was a sort of prescriptive plan and so on. But he said to me at that point, I'm thinking I might try and feed you straight through down this track and see if we can't sort of try and open it up from the back. So he was still thinking in flexible and imaginative terms. I think it's worth, you know, in all fairness to him, to emphasize that. And he said, well, I'm going to go forward and see what it looks like. And he got about 200 or 300 yards and then started attracting small arms fire. So that idea clearly wasn't going to work. And he came back to me and said, right, you know, I've been shot at from that hill over there. And I said, which hill? And it was a really black night. And, you know, it was all pretty flat ground, really. So that one over there, so I thought, well, you know, just, okay, advance the contact and see what happens. And we started drawing small arms fire the same as he had. We moved down. And I could see this sort of low mound where it's coming from. So I launched an attack with 12 platoon leading. And got on, I mean, you know, the air was thick with lead, or at least tracer anyway. But I think it was all going over our heads. So we got onto that position without really any difficulty at all. Quite interesting. I mean, it was almost, well, you know, we were suckered almost, because we started clearing that position. A lot of Well, probably over half the Argentinians still on that position were lying in the bottom of the trenches with their sleeping bags pulled over their heads, as if to sort of say, it's nothing to do with me, governor, you know. It didn't really always end very well for them, I have to say. Then, you know, we just started to reorganize on that position. And 10th platoon on my right then started coming under fairly serious machine gun fire from at least 2 machine gun positions. And then, you know, seconds later reported they were picking up casualties. And I got to say that I really, I was pretty flat-footed. I suppose perhaps I got a bit complacent, you know, we secured this position, right, okay, reorganize it, and suddenly all this starts to let loose. And I couldn't really see exactly where this enemy position was. I couldn't really tell exactly where 10 platoon was. So, you know, you get the feeling that, you know, an exercise and everything else, everyone sort of immediately looks to the company commander, sort of say, give us an answer. And if I'm honest, I didn't have an answer. So it really did come down to the initiative of platoon commanders and section commanders in the end, and it was 11 platoon over my left rear who eventually did a big sweep round to their right, platoon commander and platoon sergeant using their initiative, who eventually sorted out that problem and took the pressure off 10 platoon. But in the process, we'd had 4 casualties altogether. Once that all sort of settled down, I started to reorganize, you know, and people being pulled in every direction. So, you know, reorganize on me didn't mean much because where the hell was I, you know, on the dark side of the moon for all anyone knew. So I put it, in the end, I put up a flare and sort of reorganized on a plot ray basis. Again, you know, probably the School of Infantry would have disapproved, you know, just get on with it in the dark, but, you know, it was the only solution I could think of. But that reorganization, and this is the really key point, that reorganization took us an hour and a half. Why? Partly because people were all over the place and, you know, totally disorientated after all the contacts. And also because we had, you know, 4 people unaccounted for. And so the question then is, you know, are they killed? Are they wounded? Are they just missing? You know, that all added to the time while we eventually found these guys, and 2 have been injured, 2 killed, I think it's the number now, and got them sorted out. So this is the point. In H's plan, H hour was 6:30. We were late crossing it anyway for various reasons, crossing the start line. So we didn't really get underway probably until 0700 Zulu. First flight was 10:30 Zulu. So that's 3.5 hours. Now, if you look at the map, we've got about 7 kilometers to cover from the start line to the 2 settlements. And in the process, you know, 6 phases of deliberate attacks to put in. So do the sums, you know, it took me 1.5 hours after that first contact to reorganize. And I know that B Company certainly didn't take as long as that after their first contact. They didn't have casualties at that point. You're clearly not going to get anywhere near the settlements by daybreak. And that was the big, that brings me really to the big fundamental flaw in the whole plan. It wasn't lack of resources, it wasn't the detail, it didn't come down to the fact that, you know, perhaps there was a cleverer solution than H came up with. It came down to the fact that our time space appreciation had been utterly hopeless. Because if we'd been able to do all this in the dark, we were going through them like a knife through butter. I mean, no question. I mean, B Company on my right had taken out two enemy positions as they sort of moved down towards Darwin Hill. You know, we sorted out our position pretty quickly in the circumstances, even if reorganization had taken a while. So, you know, we were going through them like a knife through butter. But once, you know, once daylight came up, then the boot absolutely went onto the other foot. Huge fields of view for the enemy, prepared positions, and so on. And that's where it all went wrong. If we got to those settlements before daylight, then all the sort of kind of criticism, whinges that came out afterwards about under resources, not enough resources, etc., wouldn't have mattered a job if we got that right, and we didn't. And I mean, if we go to, I think this slide is slide 6, will just give you an impression of what I'm talking about. That's the ground, and the sort of yellow circle highlights sort of Darwin Hill, and at daybreak, I mean, the position, I mean, really, we were not even halfway to Goose Green. If you look at that photograph, you can look at the ground. It's absolutely bald, pretty featureless, virtually no cover, and so we had problems on our hands. And the situation really was, A Company had been ambushed from the top of Darwin Hill as they tried to sort of work their way towards the Darwin settlement. B Company had there's a sort of feature called the Goose Line, which is a dark little ribbon running across on this photograph, running across from east to west. It got just beyond the Goose Line and it had gone forward slope, still in the dark. And then came, as daylight came up, found they were forward slope and under fire from the Bocker House position. The Bocker House is marked on that photograph, but the position itself is about 500 yards beyond what we call the Bocker position, which had 0.5 heavy machine guns on it. So that gave them a range of something like sort of 12 to 1800 meters, and all they had was GPMG and the light roll. So I mean, they were outranged and pinned down on that forward slope. And things effectively, as daylight came to ground to a standstill. I was back in reserve again then, and was some sort of 700 or 800 meters north of the Goose Line. That's sort of looking up towards the bottom of the photograph, things are not looking good. H was at this point with A Company. I think he'd again joined them in the dark. I think he was right behind his lead company, which is probably where you'd expect him to be. And as daylight came up, again, I think, frankly, he found himself in the wrong position because he got progressively pulled into A Company's battle for Darwin Hill. And I mean, I think it's probably the single hardest engagement of the whole battle. I mean, it went on for sort of a good 3 to 4 hours, and it really was sort of just cudgeling their way, from position to position. I mean, it's good old close quarter fighting, and I mean, close quarter bayonets and all. I mean, it's probably worth just recounting that H at one stage said, we need to pare the weight down, so we don't need bayonets. We will win this with firepower. But I managed to persuade him that actually that wasn't a good idea because the Toms wanted them as spare tin openers. So fortunately, we did have our bayonets, but could have been a tricky moment otherwise. At this point, I'm quite interesting. I was surrounded by a number of dead enemy that B Company had dispatched earlier in the night, and one or two of my Toms started to sort of look for the elusive gold Rolex, and I was probably quite tempted myself, if I'm honest. But something just sort of whispered in my ear, as it were, this was not the right thing to do. Not because of any sort of moralistic sort of viewpoint, but because if we were doing that, then we wouldn't be concentrating on what we should be concentrating on. So I sort of quietly put a stop to that. I think it's one of the people say, so what was your key decision down there? And I think my key decision, one of them, was certainly stepping in at that point, because I think it set the tone from then onwards very clearly as to how we were going to, conduct ourselves in this war. And then, if you look at the sort of the right side of the isthmus, as you look at the picture, there's a sort of tongue of land sticking out, and I started seeing enemy we'd obviously missed in the night, sort of scurrying along the coastline and across that bit of land there, southwards towards their own, trying to get back to their own positions. And I tried to engage those; they're completely hopelessly out of range, so just wasting ammunition. But it did make me think maybe we could turn this by doing a sort of right flanking down towards Bocker House, and then sort of turning the position in that way and bringing pressure elsewhere. And I offered up that idea to H. As I say, I think sadly by then he was too. Had he been where I was, he might have been more receptive. But he was, I think, so involved in A Company's battle at this stage that he just really sort of said, "Stop, keep off the net. I'm trying to fight a battle down here." So okay, I did. And then progressively, I could see ourselves being bracketed by enemy artillery. So I felt H had sort of made it very clear he wanted me to stay where I was. Didn't want to risk me getting involved at that point. But I decided to move off that little knoll I was on, because we were clearly, being zeroed in on. And again, I put the offer to H that I thought we could get down to the coast. On the west side of the isthmus, do a right flanking, and again we got the response, stop trying to tell me how to run my battle. So we got into the lee of Darwin, sort of Darwin feature, if you like, sort of stretches right across the isthmus, that point in the Gorse line. Got ourselves hopefully blind to the enemy artillery observer. And I thought, we're going nowhere for any time soon. I couldn't see anything that was going to break this for a while. So I told the company to get a brew on. We hadn't eaten since, about last night, the night before. And now it's not, this battle was supposed to have been over by first light or just after. And it was clearly now going to go on for another good while yet. So not the sort of thing you do on a School of Infantry exercise, I suppose, mid-battle, get a brew on, but it seemed at this point the best thing to do is to get some fuel inside us. And it was about then that H was shot on the sort of battle for Darwin Hill itself, leading a charge. And again, you have to question, was that what he should have been doing? I think it's what we all expected of him. He was a passionate believer in leading from the front and not asking your troops to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. We all kind of always, right from the start, kind of expected almost that he would meet an early end. The battalion mentally was prepared for it because he was that sort of bloke. So people would sort of ask, what was the impact, because COs down and all that sort of thing, can have devastating consequences on morale and so on. And I got to say, it really didn't. But what it did do, unfortunately for me, was Chris Giebel took over and ordered me straight away to go and try and find B Company and see what I could do to help them. So my porridge had just come to the boil, and it was not a welcome order at that point, but we staggered off with all of us looking like sort of gypsies, I guess, with the cups hanging from one hand and so on, and moved forward really to the crest of the hill ahead of us, and then we started getting fire from the Bocker position as well, and I decided it was effective enemy fire when one of my signalers got the side pocket of his trousers shot off. I know School of Infantry say wait until you start picking up casualties, but didn't seem to be very helpful to do that. So I pulled back, and again this time I offered the solution to Chris Keaton and said, look, I really think I'd like to get down onto the coast and see if we can work our way around these positions So he gave me the go-ahead for that. And we got within 500 yards of the Bocker position, these .5 machine guns, probably a bit less. And then it was a billiard table of sort of bald grass ahead of us, which had been, eaten down to nothing by the sheep and so on. So clearly we couldn't move forward from there, but at least now we were in machine gun range. Simultaneous to this, it seems that Darwin Hill fell and John Crossland got the Milan forward onto Darwin Hill, and he was at the same time then able to start engaging the Bocker position with Milan. And so it's sort of a little double act, really. I think the Milan were the deciding factor in the end. But, Milan missile hit one of their .5 bunkers, and the survivors tried to sort of crawl for shelter elsewhere. I would sort of slot them with our machine guns. And within a very short time, the white flag started to show. And my reasoning was, if this is a genuine surrender, we're going to save time and very, very precious ammunition. So I suggested that that's, what we did, that we respected the white flags and that I would go and take surrender. It took about half an hour, probably longer, before that was all finally agreed. I mean, you can see the potential risks and so on. And I forced the answer in the end by telling Chris Keeble that if I didn't get a decision soon, I'd be cut off by the tide. There's virtually no tide down the Falklands, but he got the decision. And so off we went. And a little story here, because it seemed this call was my call. If this was a trap, then it seemed to me that as it was my call, I had to test it or not. And so I said, right, I will lead this. And I got up to move, and one of my section commanders, Corporal Harley, pushed me to the ground very quickly and said, this is Tom's work, sir. You're needed elsewhere. So I was rather grateful to Tom Harley for that. Anyway, he did lead that behind the cover on the beach, and there was no returning fire. So hearts in our mouths, we kind of, as it were, marched the 500 meters up to the .5 positions. A couple of mishaps. One of the Toms set off a mine on the way. One of the Milans fired a missile while we were on our way as well. Thought, God, it's all going to unravel. But fortunately, we got there, and well, it was the longest 500 yards that I can remember of my life, probably. I think we got a slide of one of my Toms as he gets there. Slide 10, yeah, it might be worth putting up. No, next way. Yeah, that was the last one, was just us doing that long 500-yard walk up to the position. And I just always look at the face of the chap on the left there, which I think says it everything. It is sort of like, thank fuck, we've made it and haven't been shot on the way. I mean, the real relief. And the place was, the position was, a disaster. Well, most of them fled. But those that were mostly injured, so it was a fairly simple question of sort of mopping that up. And what I could see ahead of me there was the enemy just tearing, who'd run off, tearing across the airfield on the way towards Goose Green. And so, thought in my mind was, hot pursuit. And I mean, with barely any proper reorganization, I set off and left, a few of my Toms to look after that position until, the sort of company echelon could take care of the prisoners. And we went for it, almost at the double, I guess. And I always remember the sight of this fleeing enemy, and the front was a guy on a tractor who we assumed was the officer, but maybe that's unfair. It had that sort of kind of feel about it. And so off we went towards Goose Green, planned to go straight across the airfield. And at that point, the Argentinian air defense weapons, these AAAs, started to engage us, firing, barrels elevated as ground targets. And that's pretty discouraging. So we had to sort of veer off into a valley to escape their fire, and ended up in the schoolhouse just north of Goose Green. And I think we might have a map. If we put up number 7, slide 7, that might be useful. So you can see there, Goose Green, you can see the schoolhouse just north of it, and you can see, in rough terms, the sort of maneuver that I was undertaking. You can also see marked out the others, what other people were doing, specifically B Company doing, once Bocker House was sort of sorted, being able to move forward and do a great big loop round to start the encirclement of Goose Green. And as we got up to the schoolhouse, kind of feeling fairly confident at this stage, you know, we were about to enter the sort of real chaos of war. I remember, first of all, we had to sort of sort out a what looked like a command post. I was trying to get a light anti-tank rocket into that, and the poor old Toms were sort of panting all over the place. Took 3 shots before we hit the target, and there was a group of us standing around us. Eventually, Corporal McCauley got the hit. Gave a little round of applause, and then we got ready just in that area to put an attack onto the schoolhouse. That was known to be a strong enemy position, and so it's a little forming up point and sort of dead ground. But we then started coming under enemy artillery fire. I called for a fire mission of my own onto the schoolhouse, and was told battery unavailable, counter battery fire, which seemed pretty perverse because it clearly wasn't neutralizing the enemy battery. We were at the end of it, and in the end, I decided we'd have to, attack without getting an artillery mission on the schoolhouse. That was a challenging moment. I remember seeing 2 Toms go down from shrapnel hits, very close to me, and there was very little we could do for them because there was a forward slope, Darwin Hill, behind us being still raked by AAA fire. So we couldn't get them out. And watching these guys, certainly one of them very close to me, sort of slowly, going down with a scream and then, dying a few minutes later with a whimper was pretty discouraging. And so I just knew we had to get that attack in pretty quickly. By then we'd been joined by elements of C Company as well. And then over the radio, I got a call that 12 Platoon's commander, who was sort of up on my right, near a Goose Green, ready to provide fire support onto the schoolhouse, had seen some white flags flying near the settlement. They'd gone up to take a surrender. And this was the first or for that matter, anyone else would have known about this. And so my first reaction was, to say, tell him to stop. And unfortunately, that message never got through. I decided I had to go and see what the hell was going on. And before I could even do that, the whole thing had unraveled. And I think it was our own machine guns had fired onto the enemy, and the whole thing had got confused. No one else knew what was going on. And from point blank, the Argentinians then fired on this platoon commander and a section he'd taken up with him to have a parley. And so it kind of looked like chaos was coming down on us. Anyway, the platoon sergeant sort of sorted that out, fortunately, by the time I got to him. And then the first thing that happened was, right, stay firm, go firm where you are, came in from Chris Keeble. And by this stage, it appeared that the thoughts of how do we bring about an end to this battle was going through Keeble's minds, and he was planning to open negotiations. Not that I knew that at the time. So we went firm, and as a preliminary, he called in a friendly airstrike. So, don't move forward. And we could hear the jets coming in. And what we then encountered was an Argentinian Skyhawk coming straight towards us from the south. and we were sort of all nice relaxed, waiting to see our own sort of aircraft laying on a firepower demonstration. I could see, I remember the cannon shots coming in, stitching in towards us. The whole company by this stage was lined up on the track. Perfect sort of aiming mark, if you like, for the pilot. And it went over, stitched us up, but fortunately no one was hit. And then 2 minutes later, we could hear the jets again, and this time it was our boys going in and dropped cluster bombs on the guns around Goose Green, and they then quietened down. And again, then I was told, right, oh yeah, before that, we then had another airstrike from a Pucara, which dropped a napalm bomb near our company headquarters. So this was a sort of pretty chaotic sort of period, and eventually, sort of approaching last light, it died down, and I was told to go firm, reverse slope, not to exploit any further forward, and that really was the sort of prelude to negotiating how we bring this to an end. And what's really interesting, I think, about this is not until that time did anyone really think through, how we're going to end this battle. And we sort of talked about earlier about elevating the mission to secure the settlements and so on, and the need for an early success. I just think had we had to fight through the settlements, and we had sort of perhaps half a dozen or more civilian casualties in the process, I just don't think that Whitehall would have seen that as the success they were hoping for. And it's always struck me as quite amazing that not until that late afternoon the Chris Keebles were really picked up this particular nettle, and that we need to negotiate. Next day, I was ordered to monitor the surrender that was negotiated, and I just couldn't believe my eyes, as I think we got another slide showing slide 12. Might just be quite interesting to look at. As the enemy just poured out of the settlement in their hundreds and hundreds, formal little ceremony, laying down of swords and everything else, and we just really couldn't believe what we'd taken on and what we'd achieved, frankly. And then on top of that, liberating the islanders who'd been locked up in the community hall for, I think, approaching a month. And I think we've got a slide 11, which might just show that. Of course, we liberated them, but, it had its price, cigarettes, please. But, so that was Goose Green. And I suspect we might be running short for Wireless Ridge.
Sadly so, but I think what we might do is we might go to a couple of the questions. One of which, just to bring in Wireless Ridge, I think somebody's asked about light infantry tactics moving forward. But I think actually what would be great just to talk about is what lessons were taken from Goose Green into Wireless Ridge, because obviously 2 Para being the only unit that fights 2 major actions in the campaign.
I'm not sure we took a huge number of lessons into Wireless Ridge. I mean, I think that we knew the lessons. I mean, if you like, we knew what had gone wrong at Goose Green, and some of that was really beyond our control. I think the point is the 2 battles are a completely different context. Goose Green, for lots of reasons, and not to do with battalion level planning or anything like that. I mean, some of it perhaps, but not much of it. Was a come as you are party. There's no question. Hadn't decided on the aim, etc., etc., etc. When we got to Wireless Ridge, several things. One is the so if you like, the aim was crystal clear. That was the sort of final hill surrounding, Stanley. Tumble down was going to be sorted out by the Scots Guards. That was and we were so that was all that really 3 Commander Brigade had to focus on, was Wireless Ridge. We were the only unit in action that night. We had the entire firepower of the whole brigade at our disposal, plus a ship, plus the CVRTs. So, I mean, it was all there really laid out on a plate for it. And that's not sort of play down that I think that the battle was very well planned. But if you like, the challenges, in a sense, were much simpler. And so I don't think it was a question of sort of saying, oh, well, we got all that wrong at Goose Green and we sort of applied the lessons and therefore got it all right on Wireless Ridge. It was much more nuanced than that. Yeah, so I think that's certainly the way I would address that. As I say, there's no question, though, that at Wireless Ridge, certainly David Chandler had taken over by then, and he made it very clear and made this promise to the battalion that we were going to fight our next battle with absolutely abundant fire support, and we had it. And his concept was, we don't need to do this the hard way. We can get the artillery to do the dirty work for us, and then, frankly, all we had to do was mop up rather than fight through most of the positions. I mean, it didn't quite hold true because the final position, various things went wrong, but that's something else.
And actually, Mark's asked a question in the chat about why command of 2 Para had passed to Chandler. Even flying him down, having to parachute into the sea to be collected, brought to the islands. Why that happened and why Major Keeble didn't just step into it.
I think, I suppose everyone expected this to be a short war, and David Chandler had been penciled in to take over from H, and I think that to be honest, there was people were still focusing on the military secretary's command plot, if you like, and that had to go through. And I think probably the argument was that it would have been very difficult for Chandler to have taken over once 2 Para from Keeble, once 2 Para had had returned to the UK. So I think had there been all the prospects of a longer war and everything else, I suspect the decision might have been different. But I think what I would say is that difficult to say whether it's right or wrong, but what I would say is that from my point of view, Chandler, when he arrived, brought in a sort of a fresh perspective, which I think was good. And by that I mean that he was very much, I think, aware that we'd had a bit of a neck stretch at Goose Green, if you like, and that we needed some sort of recovery if we were going to go into battle again and be effective. So he certainly brought that perspective to it, and I think he also probably brought a more sophisticated approach to the planning of Wireless Ridge than we might have had otherwise, where it was very much sort of we're going to win this by sheer aggression sort of thing. Yeah, that's one way, but there are cleverer ways.
And after Goose Green, what had been the general sort of within the battalion? Had there been the sense of that's our part in this done, and now we're going to sit? Was it let's carry on, let's keep going, let's move on to the next role? How would that been managed out?
Yeah, I think the mindset was very much, we got to keep going, certainly, and that sort of led us to the coup de Mare operation, which got us into Fitzroy and Bluff Cove. That in a sense also brought its own problems. So yeah, there's certainly the sort of aggressive mindset that H had instilled was still very much there, but there was also, I think, there was an undertone as well of actually we've done our bit. We really it's other people's turn now to get seriously stuck in. Rather than not have been committed to Wireless Ridge. So that had to be addressed, and I think that again, Chandler was acutely aware that this was going to be a big challenge, and determined to make sure that we had some chance for recovery, and I think equally absolutely determined that he was not going to commit the battalion to another neck stretch, that we would have all the fire support that we could possibly need. There was another thing too that I remember at Goose Green, that the number of my Toms going sick after the battle just seemed to sort of tick up a bit. We'd had a couple of people go sick with trench feet and things like that already. But suddenly there sort of seemed to be sort of half a dozen or more. And the risk was, if they went to see the doctor, the RMO, and he decided they'd need casevacing, we were unlikely to get them back. And we were already, 10 men short after Goose Green in the company, 8 killed and 12 men short and 4 wounded. So couldn't afford to lose any more. I kind of thought about this, and I think what it was really was, there weren't people seriously sick. I think they were just in need of a bit of reassurance after this sort of Goose Green neck stretch. And so I just quite simply said, no one goes to see the RMO without first seeing my company sergeant major, who could be a persuasive man. So the trickle of sickies sort of, died away. And I mean that sincerely about my sergeant major, Nobby Clark. I mean, he was a cute man. He knew when it needed a sharp pencil up someone's nose, or when it needed an arm around the shoulder, and he managed that very well.
And I mean, obviously, so two paras sort of fight the first major land offensive, and they fight the last major land offensive of the campaign. And you sort of, I remember when we did, you talked about what you were saying about the Argentinians streaming back into Goose Green, but you also had a similar experience at Wireless Ridge.
Yeah, I think the Wireless Ridge, the final moment on Wireless Ridge was pretty dramatic. I mean, we'd come through a pretty uncomfortable period. We'd had a fire mission from our own guns fired on us, and picking up another 2 casualties. Then we had a fairly serious fight through on the final objective, where again, the guns hadn't been adjusted beforehand. A sort of catalogue of sort of cock-ups there. And then after we'd secured that final position, Tumble Down, which dominates Wireless Ridge, was still in enemy hands. So from securing Wireless Ridge until Tumble Down fell, it was about 2 hours, about at daylight. Again, a really, really uncomfortable couple of hours. But as Tumble Down fell, I mean, we were sitting there, we could see, actually, we'd already seen, we had Stanley in sight. Interestingly, earlier in the battle, we'd seen the lights of Stanley had been left on all night, I suppose, sort of some sort of, don't bomb here sort of thing. We saw the enemy pouring off Tumble Down, literally just sort of walking down in single file, in their hundreds, and tried to get fire missions onto that, but the guns were otherwise engaged again. And at the same time, we saw, again, sort of in their hundreds, Argentinians walking out of Stanley up onto the top of Sapper Hill, just to the south of Stanley. And it's unbelievable. But every time I couldn't get the guns, so I was trying to engage them with my machine guns. The ranges really made it pretty pointless. And the other thing that happened, every time we opened up in the dark with the machine gun, we immediately got enemy artillery fire back. And at daybreak, or shortly after daybreak, David Chandler came up to join me and said, why aren't you engaging them? And I said, well, guns aren't available, and they're out of range. No, get cracking after them and that sort of thing. So I thought, well, I'll just get one machine gun right at the far end of the position to engage, because I don't really want the whole position smashed by incoming artillery. Nothing came back. and it was like a light switch being turned off, as if, you know, literally just something happened. You know, collapse had tumbled down. I think by then we had successfully engaged the, you know, neutralized some of the enemy guns in Stanley and so on. And it was like a light switch being turned off. All opposition suddenly ceased. Absolutely dramatic. And I mean, Chalmers' reaction straight away was, right, we need to get going straight into Stanley, and was trying to get permission from Julian Thompson, the brigadier. And he couldn't convey until Thompson eventually came up and saw with his own eyes what was happening and said, God, you know, it was that sudden and abrupt. And then Thompson said, you know, right, yeah, get cracking into Stanley, don't let them reorganize. But I think they had just, you know, taken that decision in minutes. It's done. And it was really a pretty dramatic moment.
And I mean, there's a few other questions here relating to sort of post campaign, but there's been one other question from Mac, which is sort of a good point, because it's the connected to it is the 11th of June today, so double checked, and obviously it's the anniversary of Three Para's attack on Longdon as well. Yeah. And you know, that is part of the preparatory attack, as part of the wider sort of mountain ring campaign to before you could leverage on as well. And I mean, how was the attitude in the wider battalion to the Three Para were going in? Did people know about it, or were people just too focused on essentially the 6 inches in front of their faces at that stage?
No, I think we were all kind of aware of the bigger picture, you know, and I think, you know, we made a point of trying to make sure that, you know, everyone was aware of the bigger picture. So certainly as we were sort of moving up towards Wireless Ridge, the night that Longdon was being fought, I mean, we were in reserve, and we knew it was Three Para engaged there, and we you know, had a fairly good idea of sort of, you know, time they were having of it. So yeah, we definitely kept to the picture. I mean, certainly I'd say that for myself, but I think probably I'd like to think we cascaded that sort of information right down to you know, private soldier or Tom level as well. I think they had a feel, perhaps not in quite so much detail, but they had a pretty good feel, I think, of what the overall picture was around the battle for Stanley.
And moving on to because again, conscious of time, and also that you've been talking for a really long time, I can ask a question to give you a bit of a break. Jennifer's asked a question about sort of, you know, looking back, you know, what part of your training do you think best equipped you for what you faced there? I guess either, you know, you personally, but also, you know, what aspect do you think had really led the battalion to perform so well?
Yeah. Several things. I mean, I've made one or two sort of side swipes at the School of Infantry as I've gone through. But I mean, actually, you know, there is no question, I think, that the basic training that is delivered through the School of Infantry and then cascaded down to units through, you know, the NCOs and officers who are trained there and so on, is pretty good. You know, when it comes to sort of close quarter fire maneuver and so on, you know, the Toms were very, I think, very well trained. But you know, it needs something more than that. I think two things really. One is that most of our exercises, especially sort of airborne exercises, where, you know, the Air Force often drop you in the wrong place or whatever. Most of our exercises, therefore, ended up in chaos of some sort. And I think sort of alluded to the fact that, you know, all the way through we were sometimes deep in chaos, like we were around the schoolhouse and so on. But even other times, only one step away from chaos, perhaps. It was all there, sort of dancing around the fringes. And I think we were used to the chaos and uncertainty from those sort of exercises that we'd undertaken. And I think that was really very, very important. You know, I think really the kind of broad sort of conclusion I draw is that it's going to happen. and it's going to happen to the enemy. It's going to happen to you. The enemy's trying to create chaos for you as well, and it's the units who can grasp the chaos and work their way through it quickest are going to succeed. And so I think that was again a tremendous advantage for us. I mean, not that when you plan an exercise in the UK that you deliberately, I don't think we ever did deliberately feed in chaos, but coincidentally, because our exercises were like that, it was actually an important aspect of our training. It's mentally as well as, in other ways, just flexibility and so on. And then I think the other bit of training really that was, absolutely vital to our success, was the Parachute Regiment selection. It is a tough selection process to get into the Parachute Regiment, and when you've succeeded in that, you earn your red beret and your wings, and that's something to be tremendously proud of. And so I think the sort of the hard training that it was P Company parachute selection, and the sort of training that followed afterwards. It was always hard training, and someone said, train hard, fight easy. So I think there was that aspect of it, but also, the huge esprit, if you like, that goes with, the red beret and the wings. All those were tremendously important, and I do think that you can't help concluding when you look at the sort of the way the odds stacked up at Goose Green, for example. Any logical appraisal would have said 2 para shouldn't have stood a chance, but we actually won, and I think that was very much a reflection on the quality of the man that we had, especially in comparison with the men that the Argentinians had. It's the spirit of the man at the end, and the ability to overcome the enemy's will to fight, which is so important.
Just one final question, which is from Michael, who is the Deputy Representative of the Falkland Islands Government in the UK. He says, firstly, I want to thank you for you and your fellow servicemen sacrifices to restore our freedom. My question is, have you returned to the Falklands since 1982, and what are your plans for the 40th anniversary next year?
Yes. Well, I have returned to the Falklands several times, once with you, Peter, but I was posted back to the Falklands for a year with my family in 1989. Which was absolutely a tremendous experience. I mean, I could have put my hands up to the military secretary and sort of said, "Oh no, not me, Governor. I can't go back there." But then I'd have probably been sent off to Catterick to count blankets or something. So I readily agreed, and I am absolutely so glad that I did. I mean, I was welcomed everywhere I went, having been a member of the task force. And that was tremendous, and my family, tremendously touching. It also gave me the chance to walk the ground that we sort of fought and laughed over in '82 in slow time, and try to make sense of actually what had happened, which was again a tremendous opportunity. That was really a great year. And then I've been back. I mean, I've gone back every time that opportunity arises. I tend to grab it. So I went down with you on one occasion. I went down in 2012 with a small film crew to record some of the things that I've talked about and so on. And regarding the 40th, well, I've actually had an invitation from the Falkland government to join them for their celebrations in June next year. So I'm really with my family, or with my wife anyway, and so I'm really looking forward to that. And let me just say, kind of looking back at this sort of this war, we had a lot of things going for us, and one of them, well, I mean, I think we were well led overall, very well led. Certainly, I mean, I think that you know, 3 Commander Brigade and Julian Thompson, we couldn't have asked for anyone better. But it goes further than that. And they all got some things wrong, and including Whitehall and so on. But I think that we felt we were well led back home from Maggie Thatcher, and that was important. Whatever your views on Maggie Thatcher, she provided the leadership that we all desperately wanted. And H used to use the cry, "We're here because we're doing it for Maggie." But then, perhaps the most vital thing is that it was a just cause, and it was not just a just cause, but it was something definite, not like the more recent conflicts we've been engaged in. It had a start. The finish was going to be very clear. Surrender of the Argentinian garrison, and as I say, all for an utterly just cause. So, I mean, I think all that, is why perhaps, why in a way the war has become so iconic. It was us as a nation just fighting on our own, not some sort of multinational force with very clear objectives and for a good cause.